Hello, everybody. This is Brad Hurst. I'm back without my cold this time, so we should have a much better presentation this time around. We're going to get back into the doctrine of Antichrist, how it developed, somewhere about what his teachings would be, and the world that the information or that the issue of the doctrine of Antichrist kind of started to arise in. We're not going to complete this in this one video. This is going to be a long series. Well, hopefully not a very long series. But we're going to do this video, and there's going to be a couple more videos specifically talking about the doctrine. And in the process of talking about the doctrine, it's not going to be possible to not address some of the issues of the territory, some of the people involved, and some of the history involved as well. So, in fact, primarily this is going to be a lot to do about the territory and the people and the history. And then I think that you, of your own conclusion, will begin to see and understand something about the doctrine, even at the end of this video, although we're not going to have it fully developed for at least another video or two after this, and then from there we'll go on to some other things regarding Antichrist. One of the most preeminent theologians of the last century, Robert Dick Wilson, president of Westminster Theological Seminary. In fact, I think he might have actually been the first president. I don't remember if he was or not, but he was back there among the founders of the seminary as one of the most prominent linguists of the last century in 1900s. He had the ability to get around in some 18 different languages in the old world, with Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and other languages and so forth and what have you. And he wrote a book on the book of Daniel. And one of the things that he stated, that when he was going to pursue information regarding the Bible and the credibility of the scriptures, he decided that he was going to go wherever the truth would lead him and not be afraid of the truth, and to publish the truth. That is what we are kind of doing. I'm not trying to be sensational, but we're going to go to places and look at things, and we're going to be taken to areas and have some ideas put in front of us that probably going to be new to a lot of people. I know it was new to me just even a few years ago when I started to kind of do more research on this, and I found it to be very helpful and very insightful, and it made things a lot more clear for me. So that's what we wanted to do. A few years ago, I did a study on this in a Sunday school group. It was very well received. Unfortunately, I've not been able to do anything since for reasons that I'm not really sure of. But nice thing about YouTube is that we can kind of reach out and to those people who want to learn and who want to know. And so that's what we're doing here. If you like the video, that's fine. Please subscribe and put a like on there. Make a comment if you would. Feel free to contact me. That would be great. So. Without much more ado, let's just get going and get into this. A lot of this is going to be, there's going to be some repetition from the last video to kind of give us a link with some additional information in that repetition. And then we're going to carry on from there and then get to our conclusions here, at least the conclusions for this portion of the series. So let's go for it. Zoroaster. We talked about Zoroaster in the past. There was some information that I didn't include in the previous series, and so I'm going to give you a little bit more information on him. He's one of the most ancient persons in the ancient world. So Zoroaster is a person of great interest to us as we begin this series. Zoroaster was an early Elamite. That's even before the Persian period, in the areas around Persia and east of Persia into Afghanistan and places like that. He was an early Elamite who appears to have lived around 1800 BC. Some would put that as a contemporary with Abraham. Some would put it as much as 400 years after Abraham, which is, I tend to think that Abraham was right around 2200 BC. The Greeks identified him, that is Zoroaster, as a Bactrian because he preached in the area province east of Iran near Afghanistan. You see Bactria to the east there, right below Russia, just above Afghanistan. Zoroaster claims to have been contacted by God, whom he knew as Ahura Mazda. By the way, this was a Trinitarian God. You mentioned, if you remember, we mentioned in the past that originally the Zoroastrian religion was Trinitarian. Okay, Ahura Mazda, who appointed him as the prophet of the true religion. Though he was very familiar with the constellations and the Mazareth, he became known for his literary works. Originally transmitted through oral tradition, the literary works were fully committed to text under the Sassanians, rulers of the Third Iranian Empire around 620 AD. What that means is if you take it back out to 1800 BC, okay, and you take that forward to 620 AD, for the most part, his literature as it is understood, or his poetry as it's understood, was translated by word of mouth. That's well more than 2,000, it's actually 2,400 years of transmitting traditions and poetry by word of mouth. This will be very important to keep in mind when we look at what has been postulated as the history of the Middle East around 620 AD. The main practices of Zoroastrianism: oral tradition supersedes the written word. I think you can see that from what we just looked at. Observance of the law, that is, morality and ceremonial washings. Worship through fire. Strong environmentalism. And it was ecumenical. If you remember, you had to be born into Zoroastrianism, but it was tolerant of other faiths. And that's probably the result of the influence of what we see coming out of Marduk, which even predated this particular religious system. The structure of the clergy. Very basic, very, very basic. The Magi. Okay, we might call that the Mahdi today. The Magi. Astrologers and priests. When we say astrologers, we are not talking about star worship. We are talking about the mother of all science, the language of myth. If you remember me talking about Hamlet's Mill by the professors from University of Frankfurt and MIT, the language of myth, it actually was a scientific language for communicating not only astronomy and mathematics, it was also a method of writing and so forth. Okay? This language is called the language of myth. We are talking about the mother of all science, the language of myth, in the observation of the heavenlies, along with the sophisticated mathematical calculations therein. As we mentioned in the previous video, the Zoroastrians and the Jews had an impact on each other. Although Zoroastrianism was already very prominent in the, prior to the Jewish influence, the Jews helped facilitate the spread and influence. As a result, the cult became known as the cult of Mithras. Mithras, by the way, was one of the persons of the Zoroastrian Trinitarian system. And that particular person, Mithras, was known as the person of the covenants and the communication of the Trinitarian position of Zoroastrianism. Eventually, as a result of what the Jews had done, the Zoroastrians dropped their Trinitarian position and became a Unitarian religion, and they emphasized Mithras, and Mithras ended up becoming a cult, a Unitarian cult. They dropped the other two aspects of their Trinitarian system. That was the impact that the Jews had on Zoroastrianism. The cult of Mithras, it was the most dominant religion of the known world from 600 BC through 600 AD. It's about 1,200 years. Its influence was felt from India to the British Islands. The most widespread and common practice of Zoroastrianism was worship of or through fire. It was thought there were some sort of connection between spirits and fire. In the East, those who practiced or adopted Zoroastrianism, and this is a repeat, okay? Those who adopted or practiced Zoroastrianism were called Parsi in Afghanistan, Farsi in India, Purs in Persia, and Pharisees in Israel and the diaspora, all of which terms mean separatist. The influence of the Pharisees both in Israel and abroad went on to produce what was called Kabbalah. See the YouTube video listed below. After the Jews returned to Israel, they rebuilt the temple and restarted the temple service. As mentioned in the first video in this series, a group of men, known as the Sanhedrin, were appointed by Ezra for the instruction of the people in the law. However, the Pharisees, think Zoroastrians, or Persianized Jews, the Pharisees took over that task while the new Judaism, Kabbalah, began to take root. Again, see the video listed below. It should be noted that there were even Jews, about 6,000, that migrated from Persia to China. I personally found this stunning. I had no idea about this until just even a few years ago. These Jews, that is, they maintained contact with their Persian counterparts for several centuries, but appeared to be unacquainted with the events of Christ for many centuries thereafter. A temple with services and Hebrew texts were maintained there until at least 1642 AD. Those Jews of Pekin, China, adopted the creed of Islam. This is important. There's a reason for that, which will be made evident later on. You can see the sources that we have there, but it's interesting to note towards the bottom that there's an entire course regarding some of the above as being taught by Professor Zhen Zhu at Nanjing University. In fact, I actually saw that course. It's quite fascinating to listen to. Greece, its impact on Israel and the Jews. This is going to get pretty intense. Zoroastrianism had a profound effect on Greek philosophy. Now keep in mind, everything comes from Marduk. Zoroastrianism is a portion of that. Zoroastrianism, that is, impacted Pythagoras, and Anaxagoras, I think I said that right, and Plato. In fact, most importantly, Plato. The influence on Plato can be seen in his development of the concept of the world of the forms, which we will address later on in this series. I hate to keep doing that to you, but I need to kind of set the foundation, and when we get back, you're going to see how these things work. In fact, we'll talk about Plato a little bit later on, even in this video. One of the problems associated with the Mesopotamian pantheon of gods is the apparent conflict of who is who and what they did or said. With the exception of Marduk, there are rank inconsistencies in the storylines of all the gods. In addition, they make conflicting statements among each other and among themselves or individually. In other words, they speak things against what they themselves actually spoke. and they seem to be held in conflict with each other. These problems, among others, make it impossible to nail down who is who said what, and who did what. From a human perspective, it does not make any sense. In fact, it doesn't make any sense from any perspective. So how in the world did something like this come about to dominate the world, or the known world at the time? So in comes Plato with the solution. Remember, Plato was heavily impacted by Babylonian literature. Because the material world of man, this is how Plato reasoned, because the material world of man is fashioned out of the corpse of Tiamat. If you remember, in one of my previous videos, I think it's Ancient Astronomy in number 7 in that series, the Great Red Dragon and Ancient Astronomy, I think it's number 7, I have a narration on the Babylonian creation epic. And in that creation epic, Tiamat is a transgender female companion of Apsu who was killed by Marduk. All right? As a result of killing her, the material world was fashioned by Marduk, okay? And it was fashioned by Marduk out of the corpse of Tiamat. And as a result, the material world is bad, and thus logic and reason are human elements which only serve to deceive and should not be considered when contemplating the spiritual world. The idea behind that is that when Marduk created not only the world but humankind out of the body or the dead corpse of Tiamat, who was vile and corrupt, that meant that everything about humanity and everything about the created world was vile and corrupt, and nothing good could come out of it. The body was considered to be bad. Material things were considered to be bad, and as a result, the logic and the reasoning that comes out of the mind of man is also bad, and it can't comprehend the spiritual world. Only the initiated, as we continue to read here, only the initiated can truly understand the things of the spiritual, and the common man must simply accept them and not concern himself with the supposed higher things. This is summarized from a book that I read. It was a very good book, and there's some other books on this, but I think this one's pretty interesting. In Search of Zarathustra, which is actually the Babylonian and the Persian word for Zoroaster. Great book. I recommend you to read it. The guy's not a believer. Very hard to see that, but he certainly does bring out some good historical points. That was Plato's answer, by the way. His solution was, we can't get it. We're not supposed to get it. And if we use our corrupt logic and reasoning, then that's going to corrupt it. And so unless you're the initiated that receive the wisdom, like the Sanhedrin or the Tana of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, or some other group, you're simply just not going to get it. That's going to play an important role when we start talking about Gnosticism in the next series. Alexander. That is Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great, that is, purposed to conquer Jerusalem, he was greeted by the priesthood. This is going to change sort of kind of like the landscape of the Middle East in ways that we probably, most of us, have never even understood. Alexander, when he was going to conquer Jerusalem, he was greeted by the priesthood. Alexander was shown that portion of the book of Daniel that indicated that the Greeks would be successful in their conquest of Persia. Here's the quote. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And he was then glad. He dismissed the whole multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him and bid them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute in the 7th year, that is the Sabbath year. He granted all they desired, and when they entreated him that he would permit them, and when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media. There was a large population over there in Mesopotamia. Babylon and Media, to enjoy their own laws also. He willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army on this condition, that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him, and many were ready to accompany him in his wars. This is going to change the whole dynamic of the Middle East for many centuries. This meeting right here. And it's a meeting that was generated out of the prophecy in the book of Daniel, not only in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8, and Daniel 11. That's the power that the scriptures have. We have the quotation of this right out of Josephus. You can see it here below. In addition to learning about his possible role in defeating Persia, Alexander appears to have been aware of a future enemy associated with Gog. Is it possible that they actually showed him something out of the book of Ezekiel as well? Accordingly, this enemy would come out of the north and occupy lands that were associated with parts of Greece, Meshech and Tubal. In order to prevent this, Alexander built great walls or gates in a mountain pass somewhere in the Caspian Sea area, most likely between the Caspian and the Black Seas. I think that this is relatively important to understand, that there's not as much documentation regarding this, but it does give us an understanding that even back in the medieval era, and even in the late New Testament era, in the first century church area, this legend was circulated about. And it gives us an idea of where they thought this enemy Gog might come from. So whether this legend is true, which I happen to believe it actually is, I think there's good reasons for it, because there were expeditions there over many centuries of people looking for it. So they had to have something more than just a rumor about this in order to do this. So when we kind of look at the map, what are we looking at? We see the Caucasus Mountains and Georgia, and the Caucasus Mountains in that rectangular area right there. That would be the only place that anyone could come out of the place that would be known or identified as Gog up and over the top of the Caspian Sea. In other words, you would have to either come down either through Turkmenistan, or you'd have to come through these mountain passes. We'll talk about Turkmenistan in another video on what the Iranians did for the express purpose of preventing the same attack that Alexander may have actually anticipated or feared. You can see, my cursor isn't working, so I can't see that. So if you look sort of in the upper right-hand corner, you can see Magog. It's got it underlined on there. It's right there by the Caspian Sea. And you can see the Caucasus Mountains right there at the end of that red line there, right there by the M of Magog. Okay, this is a very, very old map. In fact, it's one of the oldest maps that I could find to help us to understand what they were talking about. And so apparently Alexander had concern about what was going to happen with regard to someone by the name of Gog, who might come out of the land of Magog. And so apparently there's good reason to think that he blocked off the mountain passes in the Caucasus Mountains area. All right, I think that this is important when we get into other videos talking about some of the peoples associated with Magog and how that's going to play a role, as I understand it. So here we go, continued. Back to the issue of the Jews. These Jews who essentially basically told Alexander, you're going to be victorious, and Alexander says, okay, you can have your laws, and by the way, if you join my army, I'm going to let you guys function the way you want to function as long as you join my army. And the net result of all of this was that Alexander, he was very successful. Okay, he was incredibly successful in his conquest, and that's in part because of the Jews. The Jews of the lands came in, and they knew the territory because they had been living there for a couple hundred years already. And so Alexander just comes in, and he's got these Jews joining him, and they're reading the scriptures. They see what the writing on the wall is, and they say, you know what? This is God's program. Let's get on board. They knew the prophecies, and as a result, they could see Greece coming. And as a result, they said, you know what? I want to be on the party that's winning here. There was no sin issue for them. They just recognized that there was going to be a changing of the guard. And so the Jews came along and they said, we're going to get on board with this. Alexander granted that, and he granted them extreme privilege. In fact, the net result was that the Jews were given preferential treatment by Alexander, and even for a time after. They not only assisted in his conquest, they went on to be given positions of authority and granted extreme privilege in parts of North Africa that came under the control of Greece. That didn't happen just in North Africa. That happened in other places as well, where the Greeks and the Jews were working together. Now, keep in mind that over time, these privileges on several occasions would produce animosity towards the Jews, and from time to time, there would be periods of persecution. But essentially, the Jews continued to maintain a certain level of influence in the places where they were established by not only Alexander, but even by some of the other generals that were to follow thereafter. Upon his conquest of Persia, Alexander was stunned at the level of astronomical, mathematic, and other scientific acquired by the Persians and the Babylonians. Now, what you have to keep in mind, the Greeks were not innovators. They were contemplators, thinking about whatever, okay? They can't be accredited with really any of the above astronomy or mathematics or other scientific knowledge. They were very good at basically taking from other people and applying it to themselves. Alexander, that is, he gathered up as much of the records of learning that he could and sent them to Aristotle. Thus, Persia and Babylon, despite being conquered, began to have an unprecedented impact on both Greek culture and thinking. The Greeks began the process of plagiarizing what they had found and essentially Hellenized it. In other words, Greekified it. That's what Hellenized means. What began to take shape was a Hellenized form of not only Zoroastrianism, but also the Babylonian pantheon of gods. Note, it is well known that early Greek society was an imitation of a Mesopotamian model. They taught that their society was established by the Wonach, which is Greek for Enoch. Agamemnon, the one who conquered Troy, was an Anak. This is a quote from Dr. Donald Kagan, professor of classics and history at Yale University. This is coming to us from Bucktooth Bible Baptist Church. This is coming to us from Yale University. In fact, I was pretty impressed with what some of this professor had to say with regard to the reliability of the biblical text. Keep in mind that Marduk was lord over the Anakim. As mentioned in an earlier video, after Marduk defeated Tiamat, the Anunnaki, or the Anakim, pledged their allegiance to Marduk through a homosexual act. Marduk gave them authority to set up fiefdoms wherein they would engage in the worship of Marduk as Baalim, taking one of the 50-plus names associated with the character traits of Marduk. Again, see Ancient Astronomy and the Great Red Dragon 7. It's a video series that we have in my YouTube link. After his conquest of Persia, Alexander went on to order the construction of Alexandria together with its lighthouse and library. Alexandria would become the center of learning for the Hellenization of the Greek world, which spanned from Macedonia to India. Basically what he's doing is he's Greekifying the information that he's getting from those cultures. In addition, Alexander ordered his men to intermarry with the Persians with the intent to bring forth a new race for a new empire. Over time, the offspring of this race was rejected by the Persians, the separatists, due to the Zoroastrian influence on society. The new breed was driven out and would in part, not in total, in part lend itself to the formation of the Arabs, which means mixed people. See the Strong's reference listed here. Upon the death of Alexander, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. The major areas were divided into 4 parts, with the largest of the 4 going to Seleucus, and there are various ways of spelling these, going to Seleucus and Ptolemy or Ptolemaeus. You can see the Seleucus portions in the green, the Ptolemaic portions in the purple, and of course the smaller ones up above. Seleucus began with some very egalitarian gestures in Babylon and Asia Minor. Seleucus prosecuted the same liberal policy in his new dominions, which had secured for him the attachment of his Babylonian subjects. This guy's really smart. He's the new guy in town, and he's going to go out there and make friends. He built a number of large cities, amongst them Laodicea and Antioch in Syria. And he encouraged the influx of wealthy, industrious, and loyal Jewish settlers by according them privileges similar to those which their brethren enjoyed in Egypt. These not only constituted them citizens, but made them in some respects independent by placing them under the government of rulers of their own. See the reference below. A period of time ensued during which the Ptolemies and the Seleucids engaged in a power struggle over Syria. This is almost kind of like a battle between Turkey and Egypt, if we were to put it in today's terms. Okay? They engaged in a power struggle over Syria, with Israel often caught in the middle. During this struggle, a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes came into power in 175 AD. He brutally persecuted the Jews and even defiled the temple sanctuary. A revolt led by Judas Maccabees eventually led to the defeat of Antiochus. After the defeat of Antiochus Epiphanes during the Maccabean revolt, 167 through 160 BC, a power struggle ensued among the Jews of Israel. The high priest, Ananias, a Hellenist, in other words, a Greekified Jew, had been banished due to his Hellenizing the youth through the establishment of a gymnasium. His son, that is, Onias' son, was the rightful heir to the priesthood, but he was bypassed for another. His son went to the Jews in Egypt. In other words, Onias' son went to the Jews in Egypt, where he founded a new temple in Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Keep in mind that Egypt was now the center of Greek learning, and that was going to have a major impact on Jewish thinking. See the reference below. In 142 BC, Greece was annexed by Rome. This would start what was called the Greco-Roman period. This period would last until about 320 AD, when the seat of power was transferred back to Greece. After being invited in for strategic purposes, Rome took possession of the Holy Land in 664 BC. It should be noted that despite the Roman control, Greece continued to Hellenize the world all the way through the Roman period. The power eventually went back to Greece with the breakup of Rome. In 63 BC, Pompey defeated the last of the Seleucid kings. His name was Mithridates. This victory was the largest expansion of Rome ever. The following quotes are key to our entire study. This is very important. I'm not putting this in there for shock value. It's going to kind of steer our thinking and where we should be looking when we're talking about this whole issue concerning the doctrine of Antichrist and so forth. When the Romans took possession of the Holy Land, a considerable number of Jews retreated to the neighborhood of Medina. Jewish settlements were numerous and ancient in that district, especially at Chaibar, 4 or 5 days' journey from Medina. Tradition asserted that the ancestor of these Jews, Chaibar, who gave his name to the whole district, was brother to Jathrib, the founder of Medina. There and around Mecca, warlike Jewish tribes had reared and held fastness. Isolated from their countrymen in Palestine, they adopted many heathen practices. At a much later period, Eldad ha-Dani visited them and described their state. He calls them descendants of the tribe of Ephraim. They were then partly fire worshippers, possibly Zoroastrians, and conjoined with this service certain licentious rites. The same authority distinguishes also between the sons of Zebulun and those of Issachar. The former, he states, were warlike, while the latter were peaceable and mostly engaged in commerce. But even the much earlier testimony of the Talmud shows that the heathen customs and the peculiar forms of idolatry and immorality common in these districts were well known to the Jewish authorities. It perhaps deserves to be mentioned that the same authorities interpret the Cush of the Bible as Arabia, although that term refers no doubt also to the coast of Ethiopia, opposite to Arabia. This Jewish interpretation of Cush tallies with the statement of a certain king of the Arabians to one of the Arabians, to a certain king, let me go back. This Jewish interpretation of Cush tallies also with the statement of a certain king of the Arabians to one of the rabbis, Aqaba. Ever hear of the Gulf of Aqaba? There's a reason why it's named after him. Here's what Aqaba says. I and my wife are Cushites. We will see Aqaba later. There's a reason why it's called the Gulf of Aqaba. Continued. But Judaism was not merely tolerated. It became dominant in Arabia. The first Jewish king of the Homerites, Abba Kabad Assad, flourished about the year 120 before Christ. Some, however, fix his reign at a much earlier date. He is stated to have been the 32nd king of the Sabians and to have decorated the great Kaaba. Did you get that? Decorated the great Kaaba. Evil-minded persons endeavored indeed to excite the king's cupidity by accounts of the treasures of the Kaaba, but the representations of the Jewish rabbis who guarded it, the Kaaba, that is, the rabbis who guarded it, not only deterred him from making any sacrilegious attempt, but eventually led to the execution of the evil counselors. After that, the king continued in Mecca for a whole year and adorned the Kaaba. This is a Jewish proselyte who's adorning the Kaaba. A king doing this. The Kaaba that the Jews, the rabbis, were guarding. He is stated to have daily sacrificed an almost incredible number of camels. Keep in mind, at this point in time, 120 before Christ, this Judaism is not the Judaism of the Old Testament, it's the Judaism of Kabbalah. Here's our references for this. If you got time to waste, go look them up. The next occupant of the throne, Abd al-Salah, son of Jul Abad, was not a direct descendant of the royal family. He also was a Jew, or, as the Arab writer consistently describes it, of the Messianic religion. This is what they were known as even prior to the time of Christ. He was succeeded by Tobai, the son of Hassan, a descendant of the former line of kings. Tobai was a zealous Jew and endeavored to convert his subjects generally to his faith. This is, again, the Judaism of Kabbalah. He is also said to have decorated the Kaaba. The Ishmaelitish ancestors of some of the native tribes were, of course, by descent connected with the Jews. It is even maintained that the Kaaba, or ancient temple of Mecca, had been originally dedicated to the God of Abraham. Apparently, the Jews of Yemen did not maintain continued and direct communications with their brethren in Palestine. Now we're all the way down in Yemen. Indeed, it seems probable that the Kaaba of Mecca occupied their minds at least the same place which the rival Jewish temple at Heliopolis had in, let me go back. Indeed, it seems probable that the Kaaba of Mecca occupied in their minds at least the same place which the rival Jewish temple at Heliopolis did in that of the Egyptian Jews. They saw the Kaaba as a sort of a temple of their own that would be one that would be sort of in place of the Jewish temple up in Jerusalem. Sort of like a replacement temple for them. Have a look. Okay? We're not making this stuff up. You can see the X's along the Mediterranean, along the Red Sea, in areas where Medina and Mecca would be, all the way down into Yemen. Ironically, the Kaaba looks remarkably like the Holy of Holies. By the time we get to the advent of Christ, there are at least 5 Jewish temple structures located in Jerusalem, Mount Gerizim, which is for Samaria, Heliopolis, Mecca, and China. By 70 AD, only 2 would remain, China and Mecca. In our time, only one remains, the Kaaba of Mecca. Folks, I'm not making this up. The information I got on this, specifically regarding the Jewish connection with the Kaaba and Mecca, comes right out of Alfred Edersheim's book on the history of the Jews. Alfred Edersheim was one of the most prominent theologians of the 1800s. In fact, there's not one person who's listening to this video who had an interest in the stars of 923 and so forth, and the Jewish feasts and so forth. There's not one person listening to this video who would be a dispensationalist if it wasn't for the work of Alfred Edersheim. We would know very little about the feast if it wasn't for the work of Alfred Edersheim. We would know very little about the migrations of the Jewish people prior to and after the destruction of 70 AD without the work of Alfred Edersheim. Alfred Edersheim himself was a Jew who was converted and decided to take the history of his people and bring it to the Christian world. The Jewish people were so angry with him that they tried to ban his book. But nonetheless, he proceeded to have it published, and his books and his literature used to be read like clockwork in the seminaries. But yet today, you hardly even hear him. I'm just telling you. During the time of Christ, the main seats for learning Kabbalah were in Babylon and Medina. The main seats for Hellenism, that is Greekism, were Alexandria and the Greek Academy at Athens. Both seem to come together in Jerusalem with the Pharisees and the Hellenized Jews. You have Kabbalah and Hellenism coming together. On the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, we see both schools of thought presented in Jerusalem. In the yellow, you see the Kabbalists. In the red, you see the Hellenists. When Stephan was interrogated by the Jews, it was done so by those of North Africa and Asia Minor. They would have been Hellenists and led by the Alexandrians. This is very clear to see in Acts chapter 6, verse 9. Then there arose a certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertarians, the Cyrenians, the Alexandrians, and them of Cilicia and of Asia, disputing with Stephan. It's right there in the text. Both schools of thought, Hellenism and Kabbalism, would go on to have a negative impact on the church. As Greek Jews and Pharisaical Jews got saved and came into the church, they would bring in some of their worldview thinking with them. The book of 1 John was written in part to address these issues as they begin to combine and morph over time. Hopefully, in our next video, we will see how John addresses both doctrines and where they were headed as we continue to search for the doctrine of Antichrist. Thank you for watching, and please share and subscribe if you have found this series to be helpful thus far. Thank you.